Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the DOT Endangered Species Act Consultation Process webinar series. We're excited to see so many folks rejoining us for session number 2. As a brief introduction this morning, my name is Katasha Cornwell. I'm with the Department of Transportation, Office of Environmental Management, and we also have Denise Rock on my team with us here again today, kind of behind the scenes, helping to address questions and any technical support. We don't have cameras today, so apologies for that, but we will be doing our best to answer questions, even if you can't see us doing that. But just as a quick reminder, this session is intended to address the ESA consultation process for transportation projects. The webinar series is kind of intended for an audience that has a little bit of NEPA background or environmental permitting background. So if there's things that you hear today that you're not as familiar with, we do have additional resources, training, guidance documents that might be helpful for you. So, and just to follow up with regard to the session series, we do have the next 2 Tuesdays set aside, March 1st and March 8th for session 3 and 4. And each session does require its own registration, so make sure you're signed up for those if you haven't done so yet and you want to join us again. So with that, I'm going to briefly hand you over to Kendra to talk about how to participate in today's webinar.
Great, thank you, Katasha. Good morning and welcome everyone to the second of a 4-part webinar series. My name is Kendra Putris and I will be assisting our presenters with today's online event. Please submit questions and comments through the question box on the GoToWebinar platform at any time throughout the presentation. We will pause during the presentation a couple of times and again at the end to address those questions and comments. There are also some available handouts that you can also download from the platform. And again, just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. Our content today and a recording link will be made available to you at a later time. I'll now turn it back over to Katasha to start today's ESA Consultation Process Part 2 webinar.
Thanks, Kendra. So we're really excited to have some of our agency ETAT folks back with us again today. Mark Cantrell from Fish and Wildlife Service is back with us to help facilitate and answer questions. We have Dave Rydeen from National Marine Fisheries, as well as Curtis Gregg from National Marine Fisheries back with us again today. Dave's going to give part of the presentation. And we have John Rublick here with us today, who's another one of our Fish and Wildlife Service ETAT folks. And since we didn't get a chance to introduce John last time, we'll do that now. John is a transportation biologist and liaison for DOT. He works at the Vero Beach Ecological Services Office. He's worked for the service since 2000, and prior to that, he was a biologist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission for 10 years in its Office of Environmental Services and Alligator Management section. So you can ask John about all his alligator wrestling experiences later on after this session, but John has an MS in biology and ecology and a BS in wildlife science from Utah State. He is particularly interested in the biology of reptiles and amphibians. So we're really excited to have John here with us today to give some of the presentation. And in addition, we have a special guest star today from Noaa, Adam Bream. He is going to give us an overview of the Sawfish. He's a recovery coordinator for the endangered smalltooth sawfish and 3 threatened species, including Johnson seagrass, scalloped hammerhead sharks, and oceanic white-tip sharks. In his role, Adam works with partners to conserve and recover these listed species while also evaluating whether the vulnerable species should be listed under the Endangered Species Act. So prior to his current role, Adam spent several years working as an estuarine fish ecologist, and he joined Noaa back in 2010. So again, we're super excited to have Adam here to kind of be our guest star and give us a species-specific highlight later on. So just a brief sort of overview of the outline that we're going to go through today. John is going to come in and talk through, kind of continue the conversation from last week, kind of talking through the consultation process, how you initiate consultation, how you go through informal consultation, and then Dave Rydeen will come back and talk about formal consultation, getting a BO, and then how you reinitiate that process if you need to later on. Again, Adam's going to give us our species highlight, and I will wrap us up with a DOT specifications overview. And then we'll have Mark Cantrell also kind of jumping in, helping to facilitate and answering sort of any burning last minute questions at the end of our session and talking about what we're going to be seeing in session number 3. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to John to get us started. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm John Rublick from Fish and Wildlife Service at the Vero Beach office. The purpose of this session, as was mentioned, is to provide an understanding of the consultation process with Fish and Wildlife Service and Noaa Fisheries. We touched on some of this information last Tuesday, and now we're going to go into a little more detail. Specifically, I'm going to discuss why DOT needs to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Noaa Fisheries on their projects, how the DOT initiates consultation with the service and Noaa Fisheries, and informal consultation and concurrence. Dr. Dave Rydeen of Noaa Fisheries will then discuss formal consultation and biological opinions. Okay, so why does the DOT have to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Noaa Fisheries on their projects? Well, simply stated, it's required by federal law. Section 7A2 of the Endangered Species Act of 1973 requires that each federal agency, in consultation with the Secretary of the Department of Interior and the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, ensure their actions are not likely to jeopardize the existence of any endangered or threatened species listed pursuant to the Act or result in the destruction or adverse modification of any critical habitat designated for these species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Department of Interior and Noaa Fisheries in the Department of Commerce are the federal agencies that have been tasked with implementing the Endangered Species Act, and we are responsible for working with federal agencies to ensure this requirement is met. I should point out that if I use the term service, I am referring to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And if I use the term the services, I'm collectively referring to both the Fish and Wildlife Service and Noaa Fisheries, because Noaa Fisheries was formerly known, and for our purposes, for many, is still known by the name National Marine Fisheries Service. So who has to consult with the services? It's the federal agency that is authorizing, funding, or carrying out an action, or a non-federal representative when that entity has been designated by the federal agency through written notice to the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service or Noaa Fisheries. The Florida Department of Transportation has been designated by the Federal Highway Administration as their official non-federal representative for consultations pursuant to Section 7 of the Act. This designation normally allows the non-federal representative to conduct informal consultations with the service and Noaa Fisheries and prepare biological assessments for actions in association with consultation. However, the DOT has assumed all consultation responsibilities of the Federal Highway Administration through a memorandum of understanding that was finalized in 2016. As such, DOT can consult with the services and Noaa Fisheries on their actions both informally and formally. It's important to point out that as a non-federal representative of the Federal Highway Administration, the DOT can only consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or Noaa Fisheries on actions that are funded or authorized by the Federal Highway Administration. State-funded DOT projects are not subject to Section 7 consultation with the service or Noaa Fisheries if they don't require authorization by federal highways. Other federal agencies can consult with the service and Noaa Fisheries on DOT projects when the DOT project requires a permit or authorization from those agencies to complete their project, and there is no federal nexus with the Federal Highway Administration. For example, when a DOT project requires a permit from the U.S. Coast Guard or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In cases where the DOT project requires funding or authorization from the Federal Highway Administration and a permit or authorization from one or more additional federal agencies, consultation is conducted with only one lead agency. The DOT or other federal agencies, action agencies, decide who will be the lead action agency for the consultation. Consultants for the DOT or other federal agencies cannot request consultation and concurrence from the service or NOAA fisheries. They can create documents in association with the consultation and insist in the process, but the request for consultation on a DOT project must come from the DOT or other federal action agency in cases where DOT is not the lead for the consultation. Now that we know why DOT needs to consult on their actions with the service and NOAA fisheries, let's discuss the consultation process now. To begin the consultation process, which federal resource agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries, should DOT contact? This is going to depend on the location of the project and which federally listed species have the potential of being affected. In general, NOAA fisheries regulates marine or saltwater species, including fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, marine invertebrates like corals, and plants such as Johnson's seagrass that are listed pursuant to the Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service regulates freshwater fish and basically all other non-marine listed species, including listed plant species pursuant to the Act. However, there are a few exceptions. For example, the West Indian manatee is a marine mammal, but responsibility for regulating the manatee has been assigned to the Fish and Wildlife Service. For the Gulf sturgeon and listed sea turtles, the service and NOAA fisheries share the regulatory responsibility, and the agency that you would contact depends on the location of the species. I'll use listed sea turtles as an example. Free swimming sea turtles, that is those occurring in water, are regulated by NOAA fisheries, whereas the Fish and Wildlife Service has been assigned regulatory responsibilities for nesting sea turtles, those sea turtles occurring on land. So the FDOT may have to consult with either the service, NOAA fisheries, or both, depending on the action and which species have the potential to be affected. So who does DOT talk to from the service or NOAA fisheries to ensure their consultation requirements pursuant to Section 7 of the Act are met? Well, let's start with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The service has 3 ecological services field offices in Florida that handle Section 7 consultations. They are located in Panama City, Jacksonville, and Vero Beach. The Panama City office handles consultations for DOT projects in the Panhandle. The Jacksonville office handles consultations of DOT projects in North Florida, and the Vero Beach office handles consultations of DOT projects in South Florida. The counties that each office covers are provided in this map on the slide. I am the service biologist that you would contact for DOT projects in South Florida. And you can contact Sakia Williams for DOT projects in North Florida. The transportation biologist position for the Panama City office is currently vacant, unfortunately. However, the service is working on refilling that position. So for now, for DOT projects in the Panhandle, you can contact my supervisor, Jose Rivera, at the Vero Beach office, and he will ensure that your project is reviewed by a service biologist and consultation is completed. What about consulting with NOAA fisheries on DOT projects? Again, the NOAA fisheries office you will contact will also depend on the location of the DOT project. For DOT projects that may affect listed species and critical habitat regulated by NOAA fisheries in Gulf Coast counties of Florida, you would contact Dr. Dave Rydeen at the NOAA fisheries office in St. Petersburg. For DOT projects that may affect listed species and critical habitat regulated by the NOAA fisheries in Atlantic coast counties of Florida, you would contact Curtis Gregg at the NOAA fisheries office in West Palm Beach. The counties that each office covers are again illustrated by the map on this slide. What happened? Oh, you went to the next slide. Excuse me. Okay, now that you know who to contact for the service and NOAA fisheries regarding consultations with the DOT will need to more clearly define the listed species and critical habitat that their project could potentially affect. The regulations for consultation procedures related to the Act require that DOT request a list of any listed or proposed species or designated or proposed critical habitat that may be present in the action area of the DOT project. The services define action area as all areas to be directly or indirectly affected by the federal action, and not just the project footprint. The purpose of the species list is to ensure that the FDOT is fully aware of any listed species, proposed species, and critical habitat and proposed critical habitat that may occur in their project area and may potentially be affected by their action. However, in practice, the service and NOAA fisheries do not insist that DOT make this request for a species list, because nowadays this information is on listed species and critical habitat is really readily available on the internet. To determine the listed species and critical habitat regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that might be affected by your project, you should visit the service's information for planning and consultation, or IPAC website. And I've included a link for the IPAC website on this slide. Likewise, to determine the listed species and critical habitat regulated by NOAA fisheries that might be affected by your project, you should visit NOAA Fisheries Southeast Regional Office website and click on the link for ESA Section 7 consultations, and then click on the link for species and critical habitat list. Using the maps and descriptions provided on these websites, DOT can pretty easily determine if critical habitat is located on or near their project. Unfortunately, the information provided for listed species on these websites is not as clear-cut. It cannot be used as definitive proof that federally listed species occur on or near the project site, only as guidance of what species might be there. For example, results of a listed species search in IPAC only provide species that are known and likely to occur in the county where the project occurs, but it doesn't tell you which listed species, if any, are reasonably certain to occur on or near the project site. To ascertain this information, further coordination with the service and NOAA fisheries, as well as species-specific surveys on the project site, may be needed. Further information on listed and proposed species, critical habitat, and candidate species can be found at the websites I have listed on this slide. This would include such information as the service's consultation areas for listed species, management guidelines for listed species, and survey guidance for listed species. Again, I also recommend contacting the service and NOAA fisheries biologists previously mentioned for more information and guidance in identifying exactly which listed species and critical habitat may occur on your project site. Now that the DOT has identified which listed species and critical habitat could occur in or near their project site, they need to determine if the project may affect them. This is the next step in the consultation process. The Fish and Wildlife Service's IPAC website provides guidance and tools for evaluating potential impacts of a development project's on listed species and critical habitat. If you're not sure if the project will affect listed species, it's probably a real good idea to discuss your project with the service or NOAA fisheries and get our opinion on it. DOT determines that their project or action will have no effect on a listed species or their designated critical habitat, then no further coordination with the service or NOAA fisheries is needed. That is, you don't need to request the service's concurrence for this determination. However, if you're unsure if no effect is the correct determination, then it is perfectly okay to talk it over with the service or NOAA fisheries biologist. If DOT determines that their project or action may affect listed species or their designated critical habitat, then further coordination with the service or NOAA fisheries is needed. May affect refers to actions that are not likely to adversely affect, as well as actions that are likely to adversely affect listed species and or designated critical habitats. Again, the three potential determinations for effects to listed species and or critical habitat from a DOT project that could be made are no effect, may affect not likely to adversely affect, or may affect likely to adversely affect. For DOT projects that may affect federally listed species or critical habitat, formal consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries is required, except if based on the preparation of a biological assessment or discussions with the service or NOAA fisheries, the DOT determines that their action is not likely to adversely affect any listed species or critical habitat. In this case, the effects of DOT's action are expected to be either entirely beneficial or insignificant or discountable. Beneficial effects are those that positively affect the species without resulting in any adverse effect. Insignificant effects are those that are so minor that they cannot be measured, detected, or evaluated. And discountable effects are those effects that are extremely unlikely to occur. This process is known as informal consultation. Informal consultation, we can define that as an optional process that includes all discussions and correspondence between the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA fisheries, and the DOT, and is designed to assist the DOT in determining the effects of their actions on listed species and critical habitat, and whether or not formal consultation is required. I should point out that according to the regulations, informal consultation is an optional process, and the DOT has the option of going straight to formal consultation if they wish to do so. During the informal consultation process, the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries may suggest modifications to a DOT action that could be implemented to avoid the likelihood of adverse effects to listed species or critical habitat. If the DOT determines in writing that their action may affect but is not likely to adversely affect listed species or critical habitat, and the service or NOAA fisheries provides written concurrence for this finding, then the consultation process is terminated and no further action is necessary. Concurrence is defined as the formal written notification of the service or NOAA fisheries agreement with DOT's determination. It fulfills the requirements of Section 7 of the Act, and further action by the DOT is not required. Now, if DOT determines that their action is likely to adversely affect listed species or designated critical habitat, then it must request initiation of formal consultation. This request is made in writing to the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries and includes the submission of a complete initiation package. Adverse effects can be defined as those that are harmful to the species or its critical habitat, and those that can result in the take of a listed species. Take is further defined as actions that harm, harass, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect listed species. Take of a listed species is prohibited by the Act, except if it is incidental to and not the purpose of an agency action. Any incidental take resulting from an action must be permitted or exempted by the services. And Dr. Dave Rydeen of NOAA Fisheries is going to discuss the topic of incidental take in his discussion of formal consultation and biological opinion. This is probably a good time to point out that for all consultations, both formal and informal, Section 782 of the Endangered Species Act requires that each federal agency uses the best scientific and commercial data available when consulting with the service or NOAA fisheries. Now let's discuss how DOT receives concurrence from the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries with respect to the informal consultation process. To receive concurrence, the DOT must provide a written request to Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries, and this request should include a determination of may affect, not likely to adversely affect, for each listed species and for any critical habitat that is not expected to be adversely affected by their action. It should also include a request that the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries concur with FDOT's determinations, and sufficient information demonstrating that each may affect, not likely to adversely affect determination is the appropriate determination. The latter is typically transmitted to the service or NOAA fisheries in a document referred to as a biological assessment or biological evaluation. So what's a biological assessment? Well, a biological assessment is defined as information prepared by or under the direction of a federal agency concerning the listed species and proposed species and their designated or potential critical habitat present in the action area of a proposed action. It contains an evaluation of the potential effects of the action on these species and their critical habitat. A biological assessment is required if the action is a major construction activity. A major construction activity is defined as a construction project or a similar or undertaking with similar effects that is a major federal action significantly affecting the quality of the human environment as referred to in the National Environmental Policy Act. So here are some examples of major and minor construction activities. A major construction activity would be something like the construction of a new roadway or the widening of an existing roadway from 2 to 4 lanes. This would be considered a major activity. What are minor construction activities? Well, just what the name intends, a minor project, such as resurfacing of an existing roadway or a construction of a new sidewalk. Okay, so what are the contents of the biological assessment? The contents of the BA are up to the discretion of the action agency, but the federal regulations for the Act recommend that you include the results of an on-site inspection of the area affected by the action to determine if listed or proposed species are present or occur seasonally, the views of recognized experts on the species at issue, a review of the literature and other information, an analysis of the effects of the action on the species and habitat, including consideration of cumulative effects and the results of any related studies, and an analysis of alternate actions considered by the federal agency for the proposed action. What are actions that don't require a biological assessment? Well, these are basically projects that are not major construction activities. However, these projects still require consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA fisheries under Section 7 of the Act, and sufficient information should be provided to allow the service and NOAA fisheries to understand the project. If no federally listed species or critical habitat are present in the action area of the project, you don't have to prepare a biological assessment. Okay, what about your concurrence request for informal consultation? What other information should you include? Well, make sure you provide a detailed project description of the project. We need to, from that project description, understand what you intend to do, where, why, how, and so forth, what the regarding the project. And if you need to, it's good to include maps and figures. You should also include in your concurrence request a description of the action area. And again, we define the action area as all areas to be directly or indirectly affected by the federal action, and not merely the immediate area involved in the action or project construction footprint. You should include the need for the project. Why do you have to do this? Also, any features of the project design that would minimize the likelihood for adverse effects to listed species or critical habitat. Include results of listed species surveys conducted on or near the project site. Also provide us with any protective measures for listed species that will be followed during the project construction. For example, the manatee in water construction conditions. Include a discussion of the effects of the action and a justification of why they are not adverse to listed species or critical habitat. And finally, certification that the DOT has used the best scientific and commercial data available. This is actually a requirement by Noaa Fisheries, and the service doesn't insist that you include this certification, but you should be using the best scientific and commercial data available during your consultation. All right, so how to submit your concurrence request once it's finished? Well, for the service, by letter or email, you should make sure that the request is sent by DOT and not from a consultant. That's not acceptable. To Noaa Fisheries, you can also send your concurrence request by letter or email, but they also, as I understand that, they have an electronic system for expedited informal consultations on their website. Okay, upon receipt of a written request for concurrence, what will the service or Noaa Fisheries do? Well, they may, after they review the project or the concurrence request, provide written concurrence, and this would end consultation on the project. In some cases, they may provide non-concurrence and request additional information on the project, since we may not have enough information to agree with your determination at the time of the request. And in this case, formal consultation will continue. Or we could provide non-concurrence and recommend that DOT request initiation of formal consultation for the project. A response from the services will be provided within 60 days, and this time frame may be extended upon mutual consent of the Fish and Wildlife Service, Noaa Fisheries, and DOT, but shall not exceed 120 days total from the date of the receipt of the DOT's written request for concurrence. Okay, so what cannot be done with respect to a DOT project during consultation? Well, Section 7D of the Endangered Species Act prohibits the action agency or applicant from making an irreversible or irretrievable commitment of resources with respect to the agency action, which has the effect of foreclosing the formulation or implementation of reasonable and prudent alternative measures. These are measures, alternatives, that could be implemented by DOT in association with their project to avoid jeopardy of a listed species or an adverse modification of a critical habitat if the service or Noaa Fisheries finds that it is likely during the consultation process. This section of the Act was added to prevent action agencies or applicants sinking money and resources into a project and rushing to begin construction of the project prior to consultation and approval of the project, with the intent to basically steamroll approval of the project. And based on this argument, and that would be based on the argument that a substantial amount of money had already been sunk into the project, and not approving the project at this point would be a big waste of money and effort. As such, Section 7D is a preventative measure to preserve basically the status quo or existing conditions at the project site throughout the entire period of consultation. Its intent is to ensure that the project's impacts to listed species and critical habitat are thoroughly and completely analyzed, and the implementation of any alternatives to avoid jeopardy of listed species or adverse modification of critical habitat are not excluded. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has affirmed that the existing conditions at the project site must be maintained during the entire consultation process. It is therefore reasonable to assume that Section 7D prohibits any activity during the consultation process that will cause significant effects to habitat, even if that activity does not result in the take of a listed species. And again, take of listed species is prohibited by the Act, and it's going to be further discussed by Dave during his presentation on formal consultation and biological opinions. Okay, so not all activities associated with a project are prohibited during the consultation process. To illustrate this, let's consider a couple of examples. Let's say FDOT has initiated consultation and proceeds with planning to construct a major highway. Is this a violation of Section 7D of the Act? Well, no, because plans can be ripped up and redone, and it wouldn't constitute an irreversible or retrievable commitment of resources, or block any efforts to put through alternatives to make sure that jeopardy of a listed species or adverse modification of a critical habitat occurs. Okay. All right. What about if DOT has initiated consultation and proceeds with the building of a major highway project prior to completion of consultation? Yes, this would be considered an example of an irreversible or irretrievable commitment of resources, and would be considered a violation of Section 7D of the Endangered Species Act. Section 7D of the Act is in force during the entire consultation process and continues until consultation is completed. In association with informal consultation, this would be when FDOT receives concurrence from the service or Noaa fisheries on their determinations. Section 7D of the Act applies to both formal and informal consultations. Fortunately, DOT is aware of their consultation responsibilities under the Act, and normally makes it a practice to complete consultation with the service on a project before they begin construction of the project. Therefore, Section 7D it's usually not an issue in association with DOT projects. Okay, so what happens when DOT determines that their action will result in adverse effects to federally listed species or designated critical habitat? Or when the service or Noaa fisheries does not concur with DOT's determination of may affect, not likely to adversely affect? and finds that adverse effects to federally listed species or critical habitat will result from the action. Formal consultation with the service and Noaa fisheries is required. And we're going to turn the presentation over now to Dr. Dave Rydeen of Noaa Fisheries to discuss formal consultation and biological opinions.
Okay, so I'm Dave Rydeen. I work for National Marine Fisheries Service. I'm the Gulf Coast Transportation Liaison for FDOT projects. So we're going to talk about formal consultation now. So as John said, what happens when the determination for your project is may affect and is likely to adversely affect an ESA listed species, or your project may result in adverse modification or destruction of designated critical habitat? Then you're required to do a formal consultation under Section 7, and that's because the proposed action has a potential to adversely affect the listed species or critical habitat. So that means a formal consultation is required, and that's a more involved process, and the services are required to generate a larger and more informative document that's called a biological opinion. So what needs to be submitted? Very similar to what you have to submit for an informal consultation. You have to give us a letter requesting consultation initiation with species determinations as far as the effects, and if there's going to be critical habitat, what your determinations are there, if there might be adverse modification or destruction of critical habitat. The consultation package should also include a biological assessment as just described by John. And the services will then review that biological assessment and determine if additional information is required, and then request that information for FDOT. Okay, so biological opinions. As I said, they are a larger and more intensive document than the relatively simple letter of concurrence you would get if you did an informal consultation. The biological opinion consists of a number of different sections that include the consultation history, a description of the proposed action and the action area, the status of the listed species and or any critical habitat, the environmental baseline, effects of the action on listed species and or critical habitat, section on cumulative effects, a jeopardy analysis for listed species and or destruction or adverse modification analysis for critical habitat if that's involved, a conclusion section, an incidental take statement, conservation recommendation, reinitiation of consultation, and finally a literature cited section. So I'll go through each of those sections and explain what they are now. So the consultation history section describes the coordination and communication that have taken place between the service involved, which would be either Noaa Fisheries or Fish and Wildlife Service. Coordination, communication between the service, the action agency, and the applicant from the initial coordination up to the point where the formal consultation was actually initiated. The proposed action and action area section describes what the project is and how it will be carried out. Then it describes what the action area is, and that's the area that John talked about that includes both direct and indirect effects due to the project. The status of the listed species and or critical habitat section lists the species and or critical habitat that may occur in the action area and whether those species or habitats are not likely or likely to be adversely affected by the project. It also describes the life history and distribution of any affected species, their population status, and threats to the species. If critical habitat is involved in a consultation, it also describes which critical habitat unit might be adversely affected, its geographic extent, and its important biological and physical features, as well as any threats to that habitat. And when we're talking about threats, we're talking about threats outside of the proposed action, other things that threaten it. The environmental baseline section describes past and present actions that have or will affect listed species and/or critical habitat. And the cumulative effects section describes future actions that are reasonably certain to occur that will affect listed species and/or critical habitat. And the key term there is reasonably certain to occur. They have to be something that is really expected to happen. Okay, then we have the jeopardy analysis and/or destruction or adverse modification analysis. And that analyzes effects of the proposed action on listed species and/or critical habitat to determine if there will be jeopardy to the continued existence of a listed species, or there will be destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat, and also determine if take will occur. The conclusion section summarizes the results of the analysis. The incidental take statement authorizes how much take is allowed, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. This section also includes reasonable and prudent measures, and these are mandatory measures that must be implemented to minimize take so that you do not result in jeopardy or adverse modification or destruction. Then there's a section with conservation recommendations, and that lists any additional actions that could be taken to help conserve the species or critical habitat. But these recommendations are not mandatory, they're just recommendations, so they don't necessarily have to be implemented. The section on reinitiation of consultation spells out what situations would warrant the need to reinitiate the formal consultation, and then finally there's a literature cited section. So, incidental take. So what is incidental take? Incidental take is basically the accidental or unintentional take of a listed species in the course of conducting an otherwise legal activity. So I'll give you an example of that. So shrimp fishers use trawl nets to catch shrimp, but they also sometimes catch sea turtles, which then drown before the net is retrieved. So while the shrimp fishermen are really only trying to catch shrimp, not sea turtles, sometimes the sea turtles get caught accidentally, incidentally, or unintentionally during that fishing process. So anytime you have incidental take anticipated, an analysis is done to estimate how much take will occur from the action you're proposing and whether that take will result in jeopardy to the species' existence, and also what measures could be implemented to reduce take. So using that shrimp fishery example again, as a measure to minimize the take of sea turtles, shrimp nets have things called turtle excluder devices installed on them that keep the turtles from going into the nets and drowning. And these excluders are basically a set of bars that go across the neck of the net that the turtles land on, but the bars are far enough apart that the shrimp go past and they go into the net. And so the turtles land on that set of bars, and there's an opening in the side of the net at that point. So the turtles get swept out of the net, then they're free to swim to the surface and breathe, and they don't drown. So that's an example of a measure that could be implemented. So, reinitiation of consultation. When is reinitiation of a formal consultation necessary? So, reinitiation of formal consultation must be requested by the action agency or by one of the services, Noaa Fisheries or Fish and Wildlife, if the amount or extent of taking specified in the incidental take statement is exceeded. So, you're allowed to take 2 turtles, and you do your project, then you take 3 turtles. So now you got to reinitiate because you've exceeded your take. Also, would reinitiate if new information reveals effects of the action that may affect listed species or critical habitat in a manner or to an extent not previously considered. Or the identified action is subsequently modified in a manner or to an extent that causes an effect to listed species or critical habitat that was not previously considered in the biological opinion. Or also, a new species is listed or critical habitat is designated that may be affected by the identified action. So let's say you've completed your formal consultation, but a year or two has gone by and you haven't started construction of the project, but in the meantime, a new species gets listed or new critical habitat gets designated that might be affected by your project, then you have to reinitiate so that those species or that critical habitat can be considered. Okay, the post-consultation process. I had to get one more shot of Johnson seagrass in there before they delist it. So post-consultation processes include the action agency and the applicant must ensure that all the mandatory measures required by the consultation are implemented. The applicant must report any injured or dead listed species that might be found in the action area, and they have to notify the services about that. The applicant must also monitor for any listed species encounters in the action area and send a final monitoring report to the action agency or whichever service is involved at the conclusion of the project. So there's two terms that occur in biological opinions sometimes that sound very similar, but they're actually different. So reasonable and prudent alternatives versus reasonable and prudent measures. So reasonable and prudent alternatives occur when the biological opinion ends with a jeopardy opinion or an adverse modification or destruction opinion issued. So these alternative methods, these reasonable and prudent alternatives, are ways you could change your project so that you would not end up with a jeopardy opinion or an adverse modification or destruction opinion for critical habitat. And that's opposed to reasonable prudent measures. Those are those mandatory measures I just talked about that you have to implement so that you actually minimize take to the extent that you don't get to a jeopardy opinion or adverse modification destruction opinion in the first place. So the bottom line is avoid formal consultations whenever you can. If you can modify your project, tweak it so that you don't have to do a formal, I would go that route. Informal consultations are much simpler and cleaner and take less time to complete. The other thing is if you do have a formal, you really do not want to end up with a jeopardy or adverse modification or destruction call, because if that's the case, your project very well may not happen at all. You can, of course, apply for a Section 7 exemption, but there's certainly no guarantee that that's going to be granted. And really, it's unlikely that most FDOT projects are going to result in jeopardy or adverse modification calls, but it's a possibility. You know, probably more likely for terrestrial stuff than things in the water, but you know, you never know. It depends on the project. So early coordination is really the best way to find out if there are potential big problems while there's still plenty of time to address any major issues that might result from the project. So always go with that early coordination, but that's what ETDM is all about. And that is it for me today. So I think we're going to see if there's any questions, and thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you guys walking us through a lot of background on the law, you know, terminology, and the processes that we have to go through, and just being really clear about the distinction between the informal and the formal consultation process. I think a couple of key points that I took away from the discussion was really about, you know, the lead agency. Again, I think John reiterated what we talked about a little bit last week, and when DOT is a lead versus when the permitting agencies might be the lead. And then just being very clear about the consultation requests need to come from DOT. So that's something we're very cognizant of, but just a good reminder. And again, just some of the list of resources that John shared, I think were really helpful. And that terminology is really critical, right? The different effect determinations that we're making. And then also, as Dave talked about, those reasonable and prudent measures, not to be confused with the other alternatives, but the reasonable prudent measures are those things coming out of your BO that we, you know, usually make into our project commitments as we're moving out of PD&E and into our design phase. So super helpful overview of the process, guys. We do have a handful of questions. I am going to try to address the first one to start with, but John, you may have some additional clarification or thoughts to add, but there's a question about trail projects, and are trail projects considered minor impacts when it comes to requiring a biological assessment? And I just want to kind of clarify that major construction does have that word significant in that definition that John was sharing earlier. And so we typically in our manual require when we have a significant impact, that's an environmental impact statement. So an EIS has to have that biological assessment. But to John's point, most every other project that's either a 2-lane to 4-lane type project, reconstruction project, or up through that new alignment is going to end up having a natural resource evaluation / that's what we call our biological assessment. So we almost always have that requirement anyway. We only go down to that tech memo, which is what we talked about last week, instead of a biological assessment if we either have no effects or we can use a key and we don't have to actually go through that informal or formal consultation process with the services. So just a little clarification there. John, do you have anything you'd like to add to that response?
No, I think what you said is fine. Again, for the minor projects, the main thing is to provide sufficient information so we can determine if it's going to adversely affect listed species or critical habitat. But I think your answer was good.
Okay, great, thanks. So our next question, and let me just pause for 1 second while I move these up as we're getting more questions in, they're kind of jumping down a little bit. So there's a good question about DOT and means and methods for the contractor. So because DOT cannot dictate means and methods to the contractors, yet we're doing the consultation during the design phase, or hopefully PD&E as well, what are some suggestions on how we accurately communicate the project impacts without knowing exactly how contractors will do the work? And so I, again, like to just offer some thoughts from a DOT perspective, and then Dave, John, Curtis, others might have some thoughts to share as well from their project-specific consultation experience on how they've asked for some certain information that may have been provided to address some of their questions about those impacts. But I really think that for the most part, the engineers that are designing a project have a pretty good idea of the different types of equipment that a contractor might be using, the types of piles that we might be installing. So they have a pretty good handle on what a contractor is likely to do, right? We don't dictate the means and methods like the question said, but there's a lot of good information we can get by just talking to the engineers about the likeliness of how a project would be constructed, the phasing, and that type of equipment that's going to be used. So I think it's really good if you're not familiar with the type of work that you're getting your consultation for, to just sit down and talk to the engineers and get some feedback. Or if you get an RAI or questions from the services about a consultation, they're a really great the engineers are a great resource to start with. But John, Dave, Curtis, anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, as you said, you can talk to the people that are doing the design and they usually have some idea. It could be a situation where they go, well, I don't know if it'll be a 24-inch wide pile or a 30-inch. So in that case, if you want to proceed with a consultation, just give us the worst case scenario. Then, you'd be covered either way. If it turns out we discuss a 30-inch pile, but you use a 24, that's not a problem because that's actually less of an adverse effect from the smaller pile. Or the other option is just to wait until you're really more certain about the information. But, you can always go with worst case scenario.
That's what I was going to suggest, the same thing, worst case scenario.
And hey, this is Mark Cantrell. I would add that that even after a contract's been let, if a particular contractor has come up with a really novel approach to some engineering or design issue, and you want to run it back past us, that would be great. Especially if it's something that we haven't seen before or you haven't seen before. If we need to think about it and say, hey, while this may be a real cost savings and imaginative way of solving a construction or scheduling problem, it might have an additional impact on the environment around it. So let's rethink it if there's something really out of the ordinary that we haven't seen before or you haven't seen before, just to make sure that that it wouldn't have an additional effect that we didn't consider previously during the consultation.
All really good points. Thank you guys for the additional thoughts on that. We're going to change over to a question for Dave specifically about any information that can be shared about the delisting of Johnson seagrass. So I'm not sure if we're jumping ahead from what you might be sharing at a a coming up session, but Dave, anything you think you might be able to share on that topic at the moment?
Actually, I think Curtis is probably a little more knowledgeable about that than me, because that's an East Coast thing. I don't really deal with Johnson's, but he may be able to shed some light.
Hi, Katasha. This is Curtis Gregg. As you pointed out, we do have a small update on the schedule for Johnson seagrass, but in a nutshell, Noaa Fisheries has advertised in the Federal Register the delisting of Johnson seagrass based on some recent genetics research. And I'll get into that in more detail during the session.
Great teaser for for the upcoming sessions. Thanks, Curtis. Another quick question about National Marine Fisheries, sort of their thoughts on our acoustic research that we're doing with regards to pile driving. And I'll just say that we are actively coordinating with National Marine Fisheries on that, where we've got some results coming in, and we have some time set up in March to actually go through that. So nothing to share at the moment, but we will be, I think, as well, hearing about some of the new tools with regard to the calculator that National Marine Fisheries has available on their website coming up as well. So more to come on that. Another clarification about, can DOT provide the documentation to the permit agency for the Fish and Wildlife Service consultation? And so John, again, or Dave, Curtis, whoever feels like jumping in here, just to clarify, that really depends on who is that lead agency. So we're not defaulting to just sending information for Fish and Wildlife Service to consult through the permitting agency. If DOT is the lead during PD&E, we remain a lead during permitting as well. And if we're not the lead because we have a state project, we may be doing some technical assistance, coordinating during that PD&E phase. But when we move into that design and permitting, then that's when the Army Corps or the U.S. Coast Guard would take over as that lead agency to actually do the consultation with the services. And yes, that would be the time that we would prepare any information to send to the permitting agency to then complete that consultation. Additional clarifications or thoughts on that question?
This is John. Yeah, I think what you said is exactly 100% on. And also in situations where you have more than one lead, remember the action agencies, DOT and whoever else is involved is going to decide who's going to be the lead. So you both don't have to consult. You just decide on one lead agency, and there's only one consultation per project. And both DOT and the other action agency can use the results of that consultation.
Great, thanks, John. And there's another question here for you as well. So for reinitiation, the person asking the question thought that they heard you say that, or maybe this is for Dave, but we'll see. For reinitiation, I thought I heard you say it might be required after a couple of years. Could you discuss this in more detail? You guys both might want to weigh in on that.
Well, I think that was something I said. That was just an example. There's no timeline there. I was just a number I picked out of the air. That just all I mean is, if you've done your consultation and then a species gets listed right after that before you've actually started construction, you have to reinitiate because that species now has to be considered. But the 2 years was just something I picked out of the air. That's nothing. It's not a requirement or a statutory thing.
Thanks for clarifying, Dave. And then one more question that we have before we take our break is talking about minimization elements. And so I'll attempt, and again, if y'all have thoughts to add, please do so, but really talking about the idea of minimizing impacts during design. Any thoughts we can share about what we're looking for with that, whether from a DOT perspective or the services, what you guys might be looking for. And then the question is also about, is DOT's compliance with their environmental specifications sufficient for these purposes? And I think that it will really depend on the situation. So if you are typically going through a consultation key and you're getting to the not likely to adversely affect determination and you're willing to follow those special provisions or whatever, I'm using bad terminology there, but those conditions that the services have available, then I think that's sufficient. But typically it's not DOT's expectation that we just reference the standard specifications or any other special provisions that we have, and that's sufficient for minimization purposes. We're really looking for the designer to do what they can to avoid and minimize impacts before going through the consultation process. So again, our guidance is not sufficient to just say we have specifications available for the contractor to follow, and that constitutes our avoidance or minimization. So John, Dave, Curtis, anything to add to that response? Okay, sounds like I at least confused everybody. So, and we will be talking about specs later on. So if you want to maybe ask any clarifying questions about my response then as well, please feel free. We did get one more question, but we're going to go ahead and hold that for our upcoming Q&A. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. Let's come back at 10:10, and then we'll get to hear from Adam, and we'll have opportunity to do Q&A with him as well after his presentation. Thank you, and we'll be back soon. Okay, I know that's a really quick break time, but we are back at 10:10, so just to try to keep us on schedule, we'll go ahead and transition over to Adam's presentation. Take it away, Adam, when you're ready. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give you a quick overview of small-tooth sawfish in the United States, and we'll start generally with all species of sawfish and then get into small-tooth sawfish, the species we're most likely to interact with here in the southeastern United States. So before we get started, I guess the first question we should answer is, what is a sawfish? Sawfish is an elasmobranch similar to sharks and rays. Its body is made of cartilage instead of skeleton or bone. They are a type of ray, not a shark, despite the fact that they have a shark-like appearance. Their mouth is on the bottom of their bodies, as is their gills. They have spiracles on top, which allow them to pump water over their gills. It also allows them to rest on the bottom instead of continually swimming like a lot of shark species. There are 5 species of sawfishes around the world. We used to have 2 in the United States, the small-tooth sawfish and the large-tooth sawfish. At this point in time, we believe the large-tooth to be extirpated from the United States. That used to be found predominantly in the Texas area, and were likely seasonal migrants from Mexico and Central America region. All sawfish are generally found in the tropical and subtropical waters around the globe. Small-tooth sawfish specifically is only in the Atlantic waters. There's a population in the Bahamas, Cuba, the United States, and historically there was some over in the western side of Africa. They're named for their saw-like snout, which is called a rostrum. And it is used for feeding. They swing that from side to side, impaling fish and maiming fish, which then flutter to the bottom, and then they can use that mouth that's on the underside of their bodies to pick those fish up off the bottom. And like I said, they feed on fish, but also crustaceans that they can root out of the mud. Next slide. This is just a couple pictures trying to show you the scale of this animal. The picture on the left-hand side is a baby sawfish, probably only a month old, give or take. That was caught here in the Tampa Bay area recently. And the picture on the right is a larger, I'm not sure if that one's reproductively mature yet or not, but certainly a large 13-foot sawfish that's on the edge of maturity, if not mature. And you can see the different environments from which they can find them. Super shallow water where we're kneeling down to the blue waters of the Florida Keys on the right. Next slide. So getting into the specifics of small-tooth sawfish as opposed to the other 4 species, their rostrum contains 22 to 29 unpaired teeth on each side. They're found in the coastal areas of the tropical Atlantic, as I said. They are historically found from Brazil through the Caribbean and up the Atlantic coast of the United States, extending as far north as the Carolinas. And now they're only found in the southeastern United States, the Bahamas, possibly Cuba, possibly Honduras, and possibly Belize. We don't think that the populations on the western side of Africa are necessarily viable anymore either. Next slide. So to get into the specifics about how the species operates and its ecology, it's a slow-growing, late-maturing species. They reproduce sexually. The mothers give birth to live young, and you'll start to think, well, holy Moses, those teeth sure look sharp. That gotta be tough on mom. But those teeth are actually covered in a gelatinous jelly-type material that slowly dissolves over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. So when we find sawfish that have that gelatinous material still on the teeth, we know that they're a newborn pup that are just a couple weeks old. The gestation period is 12 months, and they have an extended period of pupping that spans from November to July for the most part. We do get some outside of that window, but that is a window to keep in mind for any large-scale projects that might be occurring over waters where they may be found. The females reproduce every other year, so they take a year off after giving birth. The brood size is 7 to 14 young. They're about 2 feet long at birth, and again, slow growing. with the exception of the early juveniles. They do double in size during their first year. They're late maturing at 7 to 11 years of age at a length of about 12 feet. And they have a long lifespan. Here I wrote 30 years, but we don't know for certain how long that is, or how long their lifespan really is. That's kind of a placeholder, but we can say with certainty that it is decades. And we have had some in captivity at different aquaria that have lived beyond 30 years. And they grow to about 16 feet in length. Next slide. So I think this is an important slide to keep in mind when we're discussing the ecology of the species. There's very different habitat use patterns between the adults and the juveniles, specifically the juveniles that are under 2 years of age or about a size of 220 centimeters. The juveniles, particularly the very young juveniles under 3 feet in length, have a very specific fidelity to very shallow waters, typically that are adjacent to red mangrove shorelines, and they use these shallow waters to avoid predators. You would think that with that saw that they would be able to protect themselves, but they do occupy the same types of habitats as bull sharks, and so they'll use those very shallow waters that they can get into with that flattened body that the sharks can't necessarily get into. And then on the higher tides, as the tide rises and those flats become a little deeper, which would allow the larger predators to access those waters, they'll slide into the red mangrove prop roots and use those as cover. So during that first 6 months of life, they have very small home ranges. They stay in these very shallow waters, lined with red mangroves, and don't venture far from those. Now, as they grow, they slowly start expanding their home range and venturing a little farther from those specific areas. Sand and mud substrate, soft bottoms, you think of them resting on the bottom, and it certainly makes sense that they would prefer those finer grained substrates as opposed to rock, but they can be found over rock as well. Gentle sloping shorelines, again, it gives them that ability to slide back and forth with the tidal range, from trying to stay in that preferred shallow water. And then, like I said, they have really small activity spaces and home ranges. Now, as they grow and they become adults, the adults have a much more variable habitat use. They occupy a variety of depths, ranging from hundreds of feet in offshore environments, offshore the reef track. They have larger activity spaces, and they'll make seasonal migrations up the coastlines. I think the core population is South Florida, but they do wander as far north as North Carolina, on the Atlantic coast, and certainly up into the panhandle of Florida and Louisiana on the Gulf Coast. But generally, that's the larger adults that are making those movements, and we tend to see most of the juveniles. And when I say most, probably 99% of all the juveniles are in South Florida. Periodically, we do get a couple outside of that range, but it's more likely that those are accidental births or they came a little early. The adults do have associations with particular passes and deeper channels in South Florida, passes between the island chain and the Keys, and passes within Florida Bay. These deeper water areas seem to be like corridors, migration corridors that they'll use. So we do target those in some of our research expeditions. Next slide. So this species was historically abundant, and you can kind of see from these photographs that single day adventures of fishing led to large numbers of catches. I just wanted to kind of give you that perspective that especially in Florida, they were quite abundant at one point in time, and you can see there was plenty of large ones. In that picture on the left, you could see a tarpon that is likely a 5-foot tarpon or so, and you can see how the scale of how large sawfish are in comparison to that one hanging tarpon. Next slide. So this is a map that kind of shows the distribution of sawfish that were found in the archives historically. So this map currently dates from 1782 to 1899. you can see there's points way north of North Carolina. Those are likely fish that were caught farther south but landed at ports north of North Carolina. And you can see it ranged all the way to Texas. So we had a distribution that spanned, the entire southeast and all the way up into the northeast. If you click forward one slide, this is going to show a progression from 1900 to 1949, and you can still see a similar distribution. Nothing really changes there. Next slide. Here's 1950 to 1969. So now you're starting to see that contraction down along the Atlantic coast. Next slide. And now we're getting from 1970 to 1989. The Atlantic coast is largely absent from the records. We're still seeing some in Texas, but that, those could be misidentified large-tooth sawfish at this point in time as well. And one more time. Here's 1990 to 2015. You can see the range has really contracted. You can see a lot more points now. This is after the listing in 2003. And so we were actively seeking out encounters and encouraging the public to report. And that's why there's so many more points for this time period, excuse me. But you'll see they're largely absent from Texas at this point in time, just a few in Louisiana. The large majority of all encounters are in the Florida Peninsula. Next slide.
Hey, Adam.
Yes, sir.
We had one question about what the difference between the yellow dots and the red stars were in those.
I'm sorry, the red stars are points that we don't have an exact location. So in a lot of, and largely they'll represent more than one point. So if someone makes a report that, oh, we caught one in Florida, but they didn't provide us any details on the location, we would attribute that to the red star. So there's one in the Gulf of Mexico there that was caught in the Gulf, but without any GPS coordinates, so we don't know exactly where. There was one caught in Florida, and I'm not quite sure why there's one in the middle of the United States, but my guess is that from the database, there was one that was said it was caught in the US, but we don't have any geographic information for it. Next slide. So what led to the decline of this species? And we started to think about that as we entered into the listing process dating back to the 1990s and the late 1990s. And we identified a number of threats, but primarily recreational fishing, commercial fishing, illegal trade, coastal development, entanglement in a variety of pollutants. The pictures on the right show you, some of that coastal development that really modified the habitat. So the top picture is dating to 1953, and that's the Cape Coral area in the Caloosahatchee River. And you can see that there was no canals dug at that point in time. And then the bottom right picture is obviously more contemporary with all the modification of that shoreline that has occurred. And then the picture on the left is obviously some recreational fishers that caught a large male sawfish and drug it up onto the beach to take this picture. And obviously he's not holding that sawfish the way we would prefer people to handle them, with his fingers in the spiracles. That's how they breathe. And so that makes things a bit tough. Next slide. Again, this shows some of those continued threats. In the upper left is, it looks like a commercial fishing boat. You'll notice the fishers of this era were wearing suits, but they caught quite a few small-tooth sawfish on this expedition. The picture in the bottom right is a contemporary shrimp trawler that continues to be a major source of take for small-tooth sawfish. Next slide. So causes of decline, we kind of talked about some of the ones that we considered during the listing process. This kind of just lays out some of the other thoughts that we had. The gillnet bycatch was probably the largest contributor to the decline of small-tooth sawfish. In Florida, up until 1995, commercial anglers used gill nets to catch primarily mullet in the inshore fishery. This just happens to overlap with the juvenile habitat of smalltooth sawfish. And as you can imagine, the rostrum or the rostra of these individual fish are easily entangled in gill nets, and they are quite problematic to untangle. And so it became a common habit of anglers to just cut the rostrum off and free the sawfish that way. But that leads to death, if not when it happens, certainly soon thereafter, as they no longer have a mechanism to feed and they starve to death. Obviously, habitat loss, as we saw from those previous photos, was a large contributor to the decline of the species, as the juveniles relied on those shallow, mangrove lined coastlines that are being developed rapidly for housing developments and trade, etc. And trawl bycatch continues to be a large contributor, more so for the larger individuals, the males and the large males and females, the reproducing population that use some of those deeper waters where the shrimpers work. So all of these things together, though, taken cumulatively, lead to the endangered status of this species. Next slide. So here's kind of the timeline in response to the decline. In 1992, the species was protected from harvest in Florida. In 2003, following a petition that we received in 1999, we listed the U.S. distinct population segment of smalltooth sawfish under the Endangered Species Act. In 2007, it was listed under Appendix 1 of CITES. 2009, critical habitat was designated in the U.S. This critical habitat is specific to the juveniles and very specific to the early juveniles that have that really small home range, that specific site fidelity to those shallow mangrove lined shorelines in Southwest Florida. In 2009, we also published a recovery plan. And then 2014, there was some strides in a global conservation strategy that was published, and all sawfish worldwide were listed under the Endangered Species Act. So at this point, all 5 species around the world are listed as endangered under the Act. Next slide. So going back to the critical habitat, here on the map on the right shows the 2 critical habitat units, the Charlotte Harbor and 10,000 Islands units. The Charlotte Harbor is the one farther to the north, 10,000 Islands, and Everglades is farther to the south. The picture on the left kind of depicts that shallow euryhaline habitat, less than 3 feet, a gentle sloping sand flat that these sawfish like to use as early juveniles. Next slide. So I think this is, an important slide for Florida Department of Transportation. This kind of marks out the hot spots or high use areas that were identified by researchers. If you want to look at the specifics, this is from Greg Polakis's paper in 2014. And these are areas after 2 decades of work that they've identified as having a higher percentage or a higher proportion of juvenile sawfish. These are areas that they go to monthly to sample, and we are trying to protect more rigorously than some of the other areas within the critical habitat unit. So this whole area is a critical habitat unit for the most part, perhaps not quite as far up as the map goes upriver, but within this critical habitat unit, these boxes demarcate the really highly important habitats where there's a higher proportion of young sawfish. And if you would click one more time, this has changed a little bit since 2014. So this red box is kind of a new box that has been drawn since 2014. And so any projects that are occurring in any of these areas, including the red box, we're going to pay particular attention to and more rigorously assess any potential impacts to the species from federal projects that could be occurring. So any bridges that would be spanning the river in these areas will require a really rigorous analysis to ensure that we're minimizing and avoiding impacts to the early juveniles. Next slide. And this is the same idea for the Peace River now, so the northern part of Charlotte Harbor, 2 other hotspots that were identified. And if you click one more time, there's going to be a new red box that kind of covers the opposite side of the river. More recently, they've determined that the other side of the river also holds a high number of young sawfish. So this area, again, is one of those areas that if a bridge would be considered in this area, that we'd have to really consider the impacts to these early juveniles. And I think that when we're talking about the bridges, the impact of noise and whether that would prevent access to this area or prevent sawfish from leaving the area if they wanted to, is one of those things that, or is one of those potential effects of the action that is particularly important. Next slide. So what is NOAA's role in the conservation and recovery of this species? You know, we do the Section 7 consultation, as Dave and John talked about earlier this morning, and we work with federal partners you know, through this consultation process to avoid and minimize any impacts to the species. We developed a recovery plan in 2009. That's kind of our framework document that lays out recovery actions and goals for recovering the species through time. That was developed in coordination with a variety of partners, including state, federal, university, nonprofit, National Park Service, etc. That document's currently being updated to provide some additional guidance and some updated criteria for recovering the species. We hope to have that out shortly. We do a lot of educational outreach, ranging from a presentation like today to presentations to the open public, to dive club meetings, fishing club meetings, boater clubs, etc. We do try to track habitat loss and take associated with all the federal projects through the Section 7 process. And we support and participate in both research and monitoring. Next slide. So going back to the presentations that Dave and John did this morning, I want to point out 2 parts of Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultation. And the first one's 7A1. And 7A1 is the requirement that all federal agencies shall utilize their authorities in the furtherance of the purposes of this act by carrying out programs for the conservation of endangered species and threatened species. And so this is more of a proactive approach. You know, you might not necessarily be doing a project, but you know, a federal action agency can make the decision to fund research or you know, put instruments in the water to collect data on how noise might affect species that are using that environment, etc. So the recovery plan identifies opportunities for actions that can be done through the 7A1 process. And then 7A2 is more the process that Dave and John talked about earlier, that the federal agencies, you know, have a project occurring in a particular area. They need to ensure that those actions funded or carried out are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered or threatened species. And so, you know, those are, you know, that goes back to what they talked about earlier. Next slide. So getting into the recovery plan specifics, this is all from the 2009 recovery plan. We have 3 primary objectives. One is to minimize the human interactions and associated injury and mortality. 2, to protect and restore habitats, and 3, to ensure abundance increases substantially, such that the species can reoccupy its more historical range from which, you know, it has been extirpated in some of those areas, especially north of Florida. There are numerous criteria associated with each of these objectives, and the recoveries and there's plenty of recovery actions aimed at achieving each of the criteria. Next slide. So the ongoing threats at this point are recreational fishing. These animals are mishandled all the time, unfortunately, and we are trying to raise awareness, you know, through our outreach efforts and through signage, through surveys with anglers, etc., to ensure that anglers know that there are safe release guidelines available, how to handle sawfish and how to free them safely. So the image on the upper right-hand side shows, a sawfish that was caught in hook and line, and obviously someone had cut its rostrum off. So while the sawfish is still alive and bit the baited hook at this point in time, it's become a scavenger and will eventually starve to death. Commercial shrimp trawling continues to be a major threat to the species. Again, this interacts with the larger individuals that, if not mature, will soon be mature. And so now we're removing the mature individuals that are, the baseline for contributing to juveniles. Illegal trade of rostra of fins for shark fin soup in the Chinese culture tends to, it's still a threat, though on a much reduced scale at this point. Habitat loss continues to be a problem, although that is being monitored through the Section 7 process. And then entanglement in a variety of marine pollutants. In this case, this is one of those bungee straps. These bungee straps are used to hold canopies on boat covers down in the Caloosahatchee River area. These bungees tend to get their way into the water, and my guess is that little plastic ball allows them to float just enough that they work their way onto a sawfish rostrum, and we have probably 20 examples of these straps being found on sawfish. Kind of work their way back the rostra and then over the head, and then you can see the sawfish kind of grows around it, and it starts to restrict the area around its gills and mouth. Next slide. This is another example of ongoing threats. This is an area in the Chokoloskee area in which recreational anglers were catching a bunch of sawfish and were throwing them up on the bank. Some of them have their rostra cut off. Some are just thrown up there with rostra intact. So obviously these anglers didn't realize it was an endangered species, and they saw them as a nuisance. Next slide. So future outlook, we have done considerable research since the time of listing. We've made a lot of management progress in how we try to manage the species and its recovery. We've increased public awareness as evident by the large numbers of encounter reports that we get from the public. We maintain a database that kind of keeps track of all that. We received encounter reports in Georgia and South Carolina over the last 5 to 10 years, which is, indicative of that recovery, such that some of those larger individuals are making those movements up the coast like they did historically. So that's all positive. At this point in time, we're writing a paper that should be coming out soon that looks at the trend in the population through time based on all the different databases that we have. That includes the research and encounter reports, etc. We can say at this point in time that the population is certainly stable and likely increasing. The 1995 Florida net ban and Everglades National Park and the restrictions of that park on commercial and recreational fishing have likely saved the species and certainly continue to aid in the species recovery. But recovery is going to take a while. And, going back to its life history, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, it's a slow growing, late maturing species. They reproduce only a few young per year, and the ongoing threat of being bycaught in the shrimp industry, reducing the number of females reproducing, will certainly hinder the rate at which recovery occurs. So the remaining concerns are federal funding levels to continue monitoring the population, enforcement of illegal acts, and then obviously identifying any emerging threats as the species recovers. As the species recovers and there's more out there in the wild, there's a higher likelihood of interaction with the human public. And so we need to come up with strategies to raise awareness and outreach methods to ensure that the public's aware of the species, aware of its endangered status, and aware of how to safely handle and interact with that species, when diving or fishing or boating. Next slide. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thanks, Adam. That was a really great presentation. We appreciate you being here with us today. I learned a few things, some good terminology about the rostrum and that they're actually raised. So I hadn't really recognized that before. So appreciate that. I was kind of curious, we do have a couple questions, but I wanted to just maybe ask one, jump ahead of the line here. But so I'm just kind of curious in terms of the consultation process, how much coordination, say, you and Dave might do together when we have a DOT project that comes in that requires consultation for the Sawfish. Do you guys coordinate together on those project effects and you provide him guidance, or how does that work?
Yes, absolutely. Dave and I have a great working relationship, and Dave reaches out to me specifically anytime a project comes in that might have effects to sawfish beyond the real minor effects that we're used to seeing. So the easy answer to your question is yes, we coordinate quite frequently.
Great, that's helpful to know. And I know you mentioned some of the noise considerations that you guys might have, and kind of there was a question earlier alluding to some of the work that we've been doing with regard to the noise impacts with pile driving. So I think that'll be good to kind of hear your thoughts on when we get to the point where we're ready to kind of share some of our results. But I was also kind of curious about some of the other research that y'all have been doing. And I think that when it comes to like sturgeon, there's some different tracking mechanisms of this, like individuals. And also we've been kind of exploring the opportunity to deal with eDNA. And I'm just kind of curious if you guys have explored or used any of those technologies when it comes to the sawfish.
Yes to both. So there was a graduate student from the University of Southern Mississippi that worked in close partnership with our state partners at FWC that was using eDNA in Florida specifically, because we know they're around, in the Caloosahatchee River. So from a presence absence standpoint, it gave us the positive interaction to prove that they were there, and we had already known that they were there in the Caloosahatchee River, but then it gave them the opportunity to use that as a marker for looking in areas where we don't necessarily know whether sawfish exist. So he was sampling areas up in Louisiana to see if he was getting any eDNA of sawfish up there. So yes, we are using that and continue to use that. As far as the research that's ongoing, there are there's 4 different programs, research programs that are currently occurring throughout the state of Florida. Tanya Wiley at Havenworth Coastal Conservation works in the Tampa Bay area specifically, and she'll set gill nets in long lines to target sawfish in that area, because the core area is Charlotte Harbor and south. And so one of the first areas we expect recovery to occur is in Tampa Bay, because it's the next major estuary to the north. And so that's kind of like that ground zero area of recovery to that former geographic distribution. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission samples all of Charlotte Harbor, including the Peace and Caloosahatchee rivers, using gill nets and drum lines. National Marine Fisheries Service has a program sampling the 10,000 islands and Florida Bay down to the Everglades, using gill nets to sample the juvenile population. And then Florida State University uses a 50-hook long line to sample the adults down. Well, they'll sample throughout the state, but largely their efforts are in Florida Bay, the Everglades, and off the reef track down in the Florida Keys. And so they'll use all of those programs use a combination of different tags. They'll all use pit tags, which are those little tags that go under the skin, similar to the tags used on pets, so they can be scanned if caught by someone else. They all use an external tag, a spaghetti tag or a cattle type tag. And then we also use acoustic tags, and that became more prevalent over the last 5 years or so. Prior to that, we did not have the permitting access to do internal implantation of those tags, and so that we were only allowed to glue them to a tag and affix it externally, and then the tag retention rate is not very good. So over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been given that permitting clearance to do the surgeries, and have been implanting 5-year and 10-year tags in sawfish, depending on the size of the sawfish, and obviously tying into the wide range of acoustic receivers that are around the state, both on the Atlantic side and the Gulf side. And we've made great strides in our understanding of habitat use and movement patterns, particularly as it relates to some of the larger individuals. And a paper just came out, I believe in 2021, authored by Jasmine Graham as the lead author, that kind of presents some of that first 5 years worth of data.
Well, it's really exciting to hear that there's so much work going on and using a lot of different technologies. Thanks for walking us through what you guys have going on there. And I think it kind of leads into a little bit of one of the questions from the audience. You mentioned Florida Bay, and there was a question about whether or not juveniles are found in Florida Bay.
Yes, juveniles are found in Florida Bay. The earliest juveniles are found in some of there's some islands or mud banks that they're kind of built like an atoll, like a coral atoll, in which there's almost a lake type environment inside these islands, and the early juveniles can be found in some of those. And then the larger juveniles, getting to 5 or 6 feet, are found pretty much throughout Florida Bay. So the early juveniles are certainly, hiding in some of those really shallow protected environments, and then as they get bigger, they start sliding out into Florida Bay proper. And I will say the large adults are also found in Florida Bay, so we get the full spectrum of ages and size ranges in Florida Bay.
Nice, good, thanks. Okay, so maybe thinking back to the maps that you showed us of those hotspots, which I think was really helpful for folks that have projects in those locations. There's also a question that kind of relates to that about how far the sawfish can go up canals or rivers.
They can go quite far up. So I think looking back to that map, there's an orange river, I believe, up the Caloosahatchee River and I don't know how many kilometers up the river it is, but it's quite far. That is an area in which juvenile sawfish are caught and encountered quite frequently. I believe that there's a paper by Greg Polakis' group from Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission that puts into perspective the habitat use along the river based on salinity. So they have an affinity for a preferred salinity, and preferred's the wrong word. They have an affinity for a salinity range, and they'll tend to stay within that range. However, so in dry years, they may move further upriver. In wet years, they tend to be down towards the mouth more. So they'll slide based on trying to stay within that range that they have an affinity for. As far as how far up canals, again, that's variable. I think it's a case-by-case scenario, but they certainly move into areas such as the Cape Coral Canal system.
Cool, thank you. That makes sense about the salinity, so that's good to understand. And then the last question, it looks like we have, are red tides a major impact to the sawfish? That's
a great question. And to this point, we have not noticed any significant impacts to sawfish from the red tide events. Obviously some of those red tide events were occurring right there in Charlotte Harbor, which is, an area of high abundance for sawfish. And we did not receive any reports of sawfish that were killed by the red tide. Now, that could be twofold. It could be that they were killed, but they don't have swim bladders, so they don't necessarily always float up to the surface. But we do recover carcasses that wash ashore quite frequently through other, well, let me step back, not quite frequently. We do get carcasses that wash ashore periodically. So I don't know that that's necessarily the case that they died from red tide and didn't come ashore. I think that given their mobility that they try to avoid some of those areas. And I think that, you know, because they prefer, again, prefers the wrong word, but because they use the early juveniles use the mouth of the Caloosahatchee, the mouth of the Peace River, and the salinity ranges within those areas that the early juveniles are using is such that it's a little lower salinity than the red tide organism generally is found. I think that organism is typically found in a little bit higher salinity water. So, you know, there's that little bit of buffer, and they're trying to, you know, they're staying in that sweet spot, you know, and, you know, dating back to that red tide event that was down there in the Charlotte Harbor area, it also coincided with that blue-green algae issue that stemmed from discharges from Lake Okeechobee. So they were kind of pinched in between those two different algal events, and we're not aware that either of them related in mortality of sawfish.
Well, maybe that's encouraging that there's one less threat. Hopefully, they have a lot of pressure going on right now, it seems like. So it looks like we have a couple of more questions popping in if you have a few more minutes, Adam.
Of course.
Okay, so does acoustic data exist for the species within Biscayne Bay? And if so, and if the data supports it, is there any potential plan to add Biscayne Bay as designated critical habitat?
There are a few points in Biscayne Bay, but Biscayne Bay was considered at the original time of designated critical habitat analysis, and it was deemed at that point in time that it was not particularly heavily used area, and that still holds true. There's not really any juveniles that are using that area. There's some adults and larger juveniles that are kind of passing through Biscayne Bay, but there doesn't seem to be any residency there. So I don't think there's any intention of us considering Biscayne Bay as critical habitat at this point in time. But the data do exist. There are a couple of tagged fish that have, you know, passed through there, and, you know, we'll continue to monitor that.
Okay, good, thank you. And then one more question. Do you have any sort of recommendations for actions that could be implemented to keep sawfish away from construction projects?
I mean, outside of trying to reduce noise, you know, from pile driving, I think that's and I'm going to say that's the easiest or the lowest hanging fruit. But obviously, I know that that's not an easy task, you know, trying to reduce noise. But outside of that, I'm not sure that there's a way to prevent them from accessing a construction area.
Right,
I would urge.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think that the big thing with construction projects is if they're occurring in areas, you know, those hotspot areas that are identified, you know, really making sure that there's a corridor that's free of noise that would allow the animals to move. You know, because if you're creating a barrier, a sound barrier, essentially, through pile driving, you know, you're either preventing access to their habitat or, you know, keeping them isolated to a habitat, and that could be detrimental. And obviously that's a concern for those early juveniles that don't like to move a whole lot. If a project was going to occur over a large period of time in one of those high use areas, you know, how would we best minimize and avoid impacts to the species? And you know, I think that would require some further consideration on a project by project basis.
Adam, this is Curtis Gregg. I have a follow-up on that point, and perhaps you can help with. Do you think that the ramp up for pile driving or a slow start, you think that they respond by leaving the area for those noise reduction efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a supporter of ramp up. Whether they leave or not, I'm not sure. I would hope that you know, sawfish, like most species, leave the area, you know, on their own volition when that occurs, as opposed to staying put and, you know, subjecting themselves to further effects. But I don't know that with certainty.
Hey, this is Dave. I'll jump in there a little bit. So one thing about sawfish is that they do not have swim bladders. And so in theory, they're less susceptible to like physical injury from noise, because the swim bladder in fish that have swim bladders, the swim bladder starts to vibrate inside the fish, and that's how they get injured. But sawfish don't have swim bladders, and they probably do not have particularly great hearing, because the swim bladder is also involved in having better hearing in fishes. So they're probably somewhat less susceptible to noise, I would say. So you know, ramp up, my feeling is ramp up doesn't hurt anything at the very least. You know, what it actually does, we don't know for sure, but it certainly doesn't hurt things. And usually the contractors have to kind of ramp up anyways, because they kind of almost got to like set the nail before they start really hitting it. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, all great feedback. Thanks for jumping in, guys. Appreciate that. And Adam, I promised last question, because then we do really need to move on. But if the species were to recover and be delisted, what would happen to the critical habitat listing?
If it's delisted, then the critical habitat designation would also be removed. I would say that that process is still several decades out, you know, because it wouldn't be just delisted, it would be downlisted first. So it would go from an endangered status to a threatened status. As a threatened species, it would maintain that critical habitat, and then we would have to continue our recovery efforts to get it from the downlisted threatened species to, you know, to a species that no longer requires the protections of the Act. So if ultimately delisted, the designated critical habitat would also be removed, but we're still a ways out from that.
Great, Adam, thanks for that. Kind of ties us right back into some of the overview of the Endangered Species Act itself. So appreciate you again being here with us today. Super great presentation, really informative, and thanks so much for your time. Feel free to stay with us as long as you'd like, but if you have other things to do, obviously feel free to you know, get on with your day. And I think we will go ahead and take one more really quick break. So if we can be back here at 11:03, we'll see you back and start on our last presentation. Thanks. All right, welcome back, everyone. That's going to be a bit of a hard act to follow, but I do think this is a pretty important topic. So we'll go through this presentation, and then we will have time to get back to those last few questions that we didn't make it to previously. And if there's any additional questions, we'll have one more round of Q&A at the end here. So we're going to just cover how DOT handles Endangered Species Act compliance with our construction contracts, and really kind of diving into specifications and an overview of that process. So this is an oversimplification of the steps that we take on our projects to be able to advertise for construction. And this is also really focused on our design, bid, build model. But generally, these are the types of items that are most important when we're conveying the endangered species related responsibilities to the contractor. So I think we pretty much all have a fairly good idea of those first couple of things, some permits and the final design, but just so we're all on the same page, we'll talk about each one just briefly. It's important, I think, to recognize that a lot of our endangered species related requirements come as permit conditions. And so we'll explain how the permits become incorporated into the contract documents. And then some of our ESA related requirements might be shown on the construction plans on occasion, right? So you might see specific areas of habitat that the contractor needs to avoid, or certain nests that the contractor needs to be aware of. Those could be shown on the plans. And obviously the plans have to be part of the contract documents so that the contractor knows what they're building. But I think the part that really gets confusing is the spec package and what goes into the spec package and how it relates to the construction project overall. So these components build together so that we can advertise that construction project. So let's look at a little bit of terminology to start with. So to me, this is a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing when it comes to explaining this, but this is the definition of the contract documents that comes from the standard specifications book. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. There's obviously a ton of different components that go into the contract documents, but a couple things that are key here, right, are the specifications and the plans. And so as we start talking about some more terminology, let's talk about some spec definitions. So standard specifications are, as they sound, right, standard to all contracts. So you can see here in this first definition that they are provisions that help direct the contractor about methods, manners of performing the work, quantities, qualities of the material, how they're supposed to furnish the project to us, right? And the standard specifications are an electronic book, and again, applicable to all department contracts. So the next definition is explaining special provisions, and special provisions revise the standard specification. So these are pre-approved, selectable options for the engineer of record when they're putting together their specifications package. And they use that menu, sort of, you can think of it like a menu of options that that engineer can pick from for things that are specific to that project or specifically applicable to that project at that time. And we'll show you what that menu looks like here after a little while. The modified special provision is a project-specific modification to an existing specification. So I know it's a lot of words, a lot of terminology that sounds very similar, but these are not pre-approved or available for selection in that menu. They're really drafted by the engineer of record and reviewed by the specifications office at the district and central office, as well as other subject matter experts. So when they come to ESA related topics, they come through the Office of Environmental Management, and we're a subject matter expert to support construction and specs on reviewing those modified special provisions. So an MSP can be drafted from scratch, or it might be revising a standard or special provision that's already been developed, but it needs a little bit of tweaking to give that extra project specific flavor to it. So again, we'll show some examples as we move on through the presentation. So now that we kind of have a little terminology down, let's get back to the idea of what goes into the contract document and what that specification package really contains. So again, think about that specification package like the full menu of additional information that the contractor has to be aware of, so that they go above and beyond those standard specs, right? Those things that are applicable to all projects obviously are pretty clear. This specification package is what the engineer puts together to tell the contractor all the additional things that apply to that specific project. So you can see that there's all kinds of different specs. Developmental specs are the types of things that we might be trying out to see if we think that they're, you know, the right way to go or not, they're doable. Technical special provisions, something more along the lines of, you could think about if the contractor's building a utility line for one of our municipalities, are going to build a water sewer line, something like that. Very technical, the valves, the pipe sizes, the fittings, all those things would be covered in a tech spec. But the types of things that we're really focused on, again, for today, when it comes to species, are the special provisions and the modified special provisions. So obviously there's a lot of parts of the contract document. So how do they kind of relate to each other, and what happens if there are different discrepancies from one document to another? So we use this governing order of documents to show how the components build on each other, and to help the construction project administrator and the contractor resolve issues if discrepancies do arise. So you can see here that the standard specs are at the bottom, since again, they apply to all projects. And as you move up the list, you can see the project plans there are kind of in the middle, where again, you might have some ESA related requirements or direction to the contractor, but most of the ESA related direction is included at that highest level in the hierarchy. And so for these purposes, this includes the modified special provisions as well. So they're pretty important when it comes to the contract package. So where are these elusive specifications found? We do have a spec website. As that definition said earlier, the standard specifications is an electronic book. It looks just like this online. Each year it changes color. So it's kind of like a DOT tradition that, you know, one year it's blue and orange, one year it's garnet and gold, one year it might be, you know, other colors. They kind of follow along with the Florida University. Sometimes it could be a random color. But when we had the hard copy books, that was always kind of a fun thing to see what color was going to be that year. But anyway, there are links right here on the web page that show, you know, you can click right on that book if you want to, or you can click that first arrow that takes you right to the book. And it's also critical for this discussion, that workbook that we'll show you later, and that's where the menu of those options for the special provisions reside. So as we open the book and we start looking at what's inside, next slide please, Kendra. Thank you. We can see the table of contents, and I think it's important to just kind of take a quick glance at this to see how the spec book is divided up into sections. So a lot of times you'll hear people refer to section such and such, right? They are the people that use the spec book on a regular basis. It rolls right off their tongue. So for me, I'm always talking about 7-1.4. That's really the main spec that I use on a regular basis. But people that have to use this a lot, that they're pretty familiar with exactly where to look for things. But since it's electronic, it's pretty handy. You can, you know, search throughout the entire book and try to find what you need. On the right-hand side, I've just kind of brought up section 7 as an example, which is again where a lot of our ESA standard specifications reside. So let's look at a few of the standard specs as we kind of think back really quick to our things that are important here today, right? So standard specifications, basic to all, required for all contracts. We'll talk about that special provision, and then we'll talk about the modified special provisions and see how they all relate. So let's moving into the standard specifications. This is that one that, like I said, rolls off my tongue, 7-1.4. You can see here, this is the compliance with the Federal Endangered Species Act. And this tells the contractor a couple of key points. First, it tells the contractor that if there are special conditions, that they will be addressed in a contract document or in the permits, which are identified in section 7-2.1. So 7-2.1 we'll look at in a minute, so keep that number in mind. The other important thing that's highlighted here in yellow that this spec tells the contractor is that when there are no other permit conditions or special measures required by the project, that the contractor will need to follow the guidelines posted here in this URL. So we'll take a look at the URL. Oh. Okay. So this spec, I'm sorry, I think my slides are a little bit out of order, but we'll just go with it. This spec shows where to find those permits. So again, section 7-2.1 is incorporating the permits that have been procured by the department into the contract package. So again, this is pretty key where if we've procured them, we are telling the contractor where to find those documents. So if you want to go to the next slide, Kendra. Okay, so this is back on the URL that takes us to those unanticipated interactions. And this is pretty important because these guidelines tell the contractor, again, how to handle interactions with a species. And you can see here from the slide, right, they're not all endangered species. We have the bald eagle, which would be protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We have other state listed species as well that may be protected. So, but this covers a bunch of things, but obviously ESA as well, we've got the Kara there. So what do we really mean when we're talking about the unintended interactions? First, we could mean that all of our analysis during PD&E and design has been completed, and we've come to the conclusion that there are no species issues on the project. So these standard specifications would come into play if, you know, unanticipatedly, right, we have a species encountered during that construction project. Another situation might be if we know that there's particular species in the project limits, say we know there's Kara in our project limits, and we've addressed those through permit conditions or special provisions, but a different species that we don't expect to be in the project limits, say like the snail kite, shows up, well, then these specifications would kick in for the contractor and he would know how to address the snail kite now. One other situation might be is if we have species that are known to occur, we've addressed that species. So you might think about gopher tortoise relocation, you might think about bat exclusion, and then we don't expect the species to, you know, be found on the construction site any longer, but they happen to come back, especially gopher tortoises, right? It's, you know, they like to come back to their home. Then the contractor may be directed back to this standard specification, this URL, with some direction on how to go about addressing that new individual that's on their project. So just for some background, most of these guidelines tell the contractor to stop work, coordinate with DOT, allow the, you know, critter, whether it's a bird, allow them to fly away. If it's an indigo snake, allow them to slither away, do their thing, don't disturb them, don't harass them. And then again, contact the appropriate DOT folks so that we can decide, do we need to have a monitor on site? Do we need to have some sort of additional coordination with the wildlife agencies to make sure that we're addressing that species appropriately? Okay, next slide, please. So what about work that's not covered by the standard specifications? So we have a very clear spec telling the contractor that that work will be found in either the plans or the additional special provisions, right? So this is really important that our standard specifications tell the contractor exactly what they need to know. So let's start looking at our next example. Again, 7-2.1 tells the contractor that if we've acquired permits, if DOT has acquired those permits ahead of time, that we will be sharing that information with the contractor. And the way we do that should be the next slide, where we expand the 7-2.1 and it shows the contractor, hey, these are the permits that DOT got. Go to this other URL and download the permits. And we really want the contractor clearly, right, to comply with the provisions contained within those permits. So as I said earlier, it's going to be really important that the EOR that's putting together the specs package knows that they have permits required for the project. They select this extra item from the menu of options that they have in the special provisions and include this document or include this special provision into their specs package so the contractor knows where to go to get those permit conditions. And as we said earlier as well, most of the ESA requirements are in the permits. So next slide should be an example. Okay. So this is the workbook. Again, we're showing the same slide as before, where we can go now to the workbook to see some of the different example special provisions. So we can get, okay. So these did get a little out of order, so I do apologize for that. But so I wanted to show this as an example of the protection measures. This is a permit condition that comes up on a regular basis, right? So we usually have indigo snakes, sometimes there's manatees, sometimes there's sea turtles. These get included as usually as a specific condition to the permit for the contractor to follow. And I want to be really clear here that this says U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, right? So these are agency developed provisions attached to a permit that then become attached to our contract through that special provision we just showed on a couple slides ago. These are not the DOT special provisions. So, okay, next slide. Okay, so now we have gone to that workbook link and we can start looking at our menu of the special provisions. So if you can either click the link or you can scroll down, and as you see here on the slide, it's kind of important to know what section of the specifications you're looking for, because if you know that, you can quickly scroll down to that right section. So if you see that top row, it says we're making changes to 7-1.4. You're going to get tired of hearing me say that number, but it's important to know what you're trying to modify, right? So as you scroll down to this menu, again, you can kind of find, it's a lot of words on this menu, but you can kind of see in the green circle on the second row, eagle, right? That kind of stands out at you. So you know that's the one that's going to modify the spec to address the eagles. And if you click on that second green circle there in the middle, then that will take you to the exact language that you would be using. One other important note here on this slide is that the bottom row, the red box for manatees, that column on the third side there on the right is what we call a usage note. So the engineer of record doesn't decide on their own to include these special provisions. They need to go talk to the environmental permit coordinator to make sure that they know what species related special provisions should be included in their contract. And that's important because you should only be using those if you don't have a permit condition. So since that was kind of difficult to see the menu in that order with that screenshot, this slide shows you the list of the full suite of special provisions that we have. So let me just kind of reiterate what I had just said, that these special provisions should only be used when there's not a permit condition, but the district has determined through consultation, through technical assistance, through some previous commitment or professional judgment that the species could occur in the area and that these conditions are necessary. So you can see the ones highlighted here that are specific to the endangered species, and we've also developed some that are related to other protected species, like we said before. Those ESA related ones, those highlighted ones, we've taken the agency specific provisions and kind of rewritten those in what I like to call contractor speak. So we have a very specific way we talk to our contractors and our specs with active imperative voice. We've kind of rewritten those to be clear to the contractor what they're required to do, and try to also provide some consistent terminology. So some of you that are really familiar with some of these agency requirements may know that sometimes you say spotter, sometimes you say monitor, and so we were trying to make ours a little bit more consistent in the terminology. But they have been reviewed by the agencies and FHWA in the past and have been used for probably about 5 years now, so they've been pretty successful. Okay, we can start looking at some examples. So this is an example for the sturgeon, and I think again it's important to recognize that when these specifications are being used, they're what we're calling we're expanding that initial expectation of the contractor under that 7-1.4 to include these additional requirements. So for this one in particular, you can see, and they look very similar from species to species for the most part, but you can see that after we make it through the information that we're supposed to provide to the contractor about the presence of the species and its appearance and its status, that we start talking about the more specific species related information about when they're likely to be in the area and what the contractor needs to do specifically to avoid any sort of impacts to the species. So the next example is for gopher tortoises. And again, we're expanding the same section of the specification. In this example, we are having the contractor be aware that there are going to be certain gopher tortoise burrows that are going to remain on the project. And again, I think if you see in that second line, as shown in the plans, that's another opportunity for us to send information to the contractor through the plans and relate it back to the specifications. The contractor is going to be installing silt fence, maintaining silt fence, and if additional gopher tortoises show up, then they have to go back to that URL we showed earlier with those unanticipated interactions and contact the department, let us know so that we can address those new individuals appropriately. Okay. Next example. So I think this is a really good one to show that we can also have special provisions for habitat, right? So this is about seagrasses and an opportunity for the contractor to be aware that there are seagrass beds, again, as shown in the plans, and that they don't want the contractor to be shading or creating a lot of turbidity or whatever to impact the seagrasses. So again, just another example that shows that we can consider more than just the species. So let's start looking at the modified special provision examples here. And so these again are not in the menu, right? All those last examples I showed you were in the menu, pre-approved, selectable for the contractor, selectable for the engineer of record to put in his specs package. These are the modified special provisions that we're going to revise even further. So this example, think back to the gopher tortoise one I showed you just a minute ago. This example is requiring the contractor to provide an authorized agent. So look at the information highlighted in gray, and I did screw up my highlighting, so ignore the first sentence of the gray highlight and look at provide an authorized gopher tortoise agent. From there down, this is new project-specific information being provided to the contractor. You need to provide the authorized agent. The agent has to be able to capture the tortoises, relocate them to the recipient site, etc., and install and maintain silt fence. So again, a revision to address the specific need of the project. Look at our next example. This one is not ESA, that's okay, but I think it's a good example to show that we don't have any special provisions as a starting point for the sandhill crane. So this is a blank slate. So even though it looks like the same format as before, the engineer of record chose to put together a spec that looked very similar, right? So it also talks about the presence of the species, the appearance, the habitat, its protected status, but then it kind of dives into the specific requirements that FWC would have for a sandhill crane if it were encountered. So you need to be 400 feet away from an active nest, and how you address the flightless young. So again, this is one that was developed from scratch for a project-specific need. Okay, next example. This one, again, we're talking about habitat again. And so there was a need to address mangroves, but I think for this one, it's important to point out that it did not expand the 7-2 or 7-1.4 that we've been talking about a lot, but it expanded the 7-2. So depending on the requirements that you're putting into your specs package, you may need to address, a different section. So just kind of, your engineer can help you figure that out if you are supporting them and writing the modified special provisions. But so there's no real limit on what we can put in the spec, but it has to be, again, for the modified special provision, it has to be project specific. And our last example, again, is one where there wasn't a specific special provision to start with, but is related to coral. So I think this shows a good range of different needs that we have and doesn't quite follow that same structure that we saw on the previous slide for the sandhill crane, right? This is, it can be whatever structure is appropriate for the actions or the requirements that we're asking the contractor to follow. So again, just another good example here of an MSP. So I think that wraps up the examples and the terminology I wanted to share with you guys about that. And we'll go ahead and move on to any additional questions with regard to the previous conversations that we've had today. And if you have any questions for me about the specification side of things, feel free to go ahead and chat those in as well. So Mark, Curtis, do you guys have any questions you wanted to start with to address?
Yes, thank you, Katasha. That was really good presentation of some important information. I do have one question, a really specific one here that Tiffany's posted, and it relates to an experience she had where a consultant requested to change the manatee special provision as a technical provision instead of a MSP. And that was apparently proposed in order to expedite the review. So is that an option to change a special provision to a technical provision as a technical provision instead of an MSP? So that's the
That's
first.
a really good question. I haven't seen that happen before, but I can confirm with our specs office and get back to you on that, Tiffany.
Okay, very good. But let's see, that's all the questions we have typed in here. I'll add that if folks have questions, now's a good time to go ahead and get those into the question box, and we'll be sure to answer those if we can, or as Katasha just said, we'll get back to you as soon as possible with an accurate answer.
Yeah, I think we might have had one question remaining from our earlier session, and I'm trying to see if I can track that one back down. So there was a question about construction, inspection, and reporting for TN species. And so what I would say in there, the question really is that generally the role of the DOT construction CEI staff. And so I think it really would depend on the way the CEI contract is set up. I think it's certainly possible for a district to choose to have the CEI do reporting, and then certainly the specs themselves may have some direction to the contractor on whether or not they report information to the CEI or to some other entity within the department, so that the department can then kind of do the official reporting to, say, like a wildlife agency, should there be like a dead sawfish found, right, or something like that, or a sturgeon or manatee. But for the most part, I think it's going to be contract dependent if it's not something already covered in the spec. Hopefully that helps address that question.
Okay, Katasha, I actually have a question. I feel like maybe I skipped one of my slides earlier. Did I talk about the timeline on formal consultations, or did I skip over that?
I want to say we did not talk about that, but
Okay, well, I can go over it real quick. So
okay,
in formal consultations, the services, either Noaa Fisheries or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, have a timeline they have to meet for formal consultations. And so the bottom line is, from the time that you officially initiate the formal consultation until the time that we have to issue a biological opinion, we have 135 days. You can get a 60-day extension on that if Noaa Fisheries / Fish and Wildlife Service and the action agency agree to that 60-day extension. If you want an extension greater than 60 days, then you have to get agreement between those two entities, and also the applicant has to agree to that. So that's all that slide was. I just want to make sure I put that out there.
great. Thanks for covering that. I think that's pretty important for our project schedules and things. So good addition there. I see, and not to jump ahead, Mark, I'm just going to jump to another question unless you had something else to say, but there's a question about projects where DOT has procured permits. Should we be adding the SP 0070201A? Thank you for paying attention. But yes, and I will say, when we say we, that really should be the engineer of record. But if you need to, you know, maybe support your EOR to make sure that's happening, then yes. And I think for those that are developing permit certifications, that's part of the role of that permit cert as well, to help the EORs know, and the specs office that's doing the review of the specs package coming from the EOR, what should be included in that package. So hopefully there's some good checks and balances in place for that already. But there's another question about, is the DOT manatee special provision interchangeable with the standard manatee conditions for in-water work? And I'm going to say yes, but we would only use the standard specification if you think you're going to have manatees in your project limits, but you did not need a permit that already includes that, right? So we did fashion our special provision for manatees off of the standard conditions for the in-water work. So hopefully that helps address that question. We do have one more question about the seagrass, but we are going to cover that in one of our upcoming sessions. So I don't think we're going to say more about that at the moment unless somebody feels differently. And then there may be another question for John or Dave or Curtis or Mark to address with regard to the Section 7 process. If the Section 7 process is, can you, I guess, explain whether the Section 7 process is just for federal projects? If a MANLA is reached on a state-funded minor project, is this just addressed through technical assistance?
Yes, it sounds like a good question for John. So if we could get
if it's just a state-funded project, we can definitely provide technical assistance on the project. However, don't ask us to provide concurrence that you would for a Section 7 project for federal action. But we will provide technical assistance on state funded projects.
And that also assumes they don't need a federal permit of some kind. It's not just the funding, it's if they need to get a permit from the Corps or the Coast Guard, you know, then there's a federal nexus.
Good clarification, Dave. So I think at this point that has answered all of the questions that are in the question box. And I don't know if Mark, you might want to start talking about the wrap up and maybe seeing if any additional questions might come in that we might want to tackle before we're done here today.
Okay, well, thank you, Katasha. And again, keep the questions coming if you have those. Just to remind you, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started out talking about the consultation process and the regulations. Remember, John Rublick presented a lot of information on the background for consultation, how to initiate consultation, and what it means once you make a determination about what the potential effect of a project is. And so we heard about the differences between informal consultation and formal consultation and what it means to get a letter of concurrence from one of the services, and also about biological opinions. So that was some really good information on the regulations and process. And then I probably don't have to remind you, you probably are still thinking about some of the neat things that Adam presented to us about the smalltooth sawfish, a really incredible fish. And so that was the first in this this 4-part series. That was the first of our species highlights. And so I hope that you found that interesting. It really is a neat fish, and you can understand some of the challenges that we have in conserving the species, as well as thinking about recovery for that small-tooth sawfish. And there's nothing small about a small-tooth sawfish. So really great eye-opening stuff there. Also, kind of an aside, don't Google it now until after we're through, but there is a small-tooth conservation society, a group that looks worldwide at the species of sawfishes, besides and including the small-tooth sawfish that Adam talked about, but the Small-Tooth Sawfish Society, and research that's going on worldwide with that imperiled group of fishes. So pretty neat stuff. If you like that, you'll be able to tune in for additional species highlights as we go through the next 2 weeks. The next 2 Tuesdays, we'll be sprinkling in some of those highlights, and you'll get to learn a little bit like I did. You may learn a lot, just like I did today, about a species, and so we'll continue those. So that was really after the informal and formal consultations, one of the species highlights. And then where the rubber hits the road, FDOT specifications that Katasha covered just now. I'm seeing some questions come in, and so we'll get to those in a second. But as a reminder that the construction contracts, that's after permitting and final design plans are in, those things that go into the specs package. And I think that was 7-1.4 compliance. So we'll
Good job, Mark.
we'll get you to repeat that a few more times for us, just so we keep it handy at the tip of our tongue. 7-1.4, and then we can talk about 7.2.1, all those standard provisions, and now we know where to find them. If you didn't already, we'll have that. So with that, that's just a kind of a review of what we've talked about today, and like I said, we covered a lot of important information, and so we'll go back here to the list of questions that you're feeding in. Really good questions. You guys are paying attention. You're thinking about these things, and it shows. So we'll try to answer some of these questions now, and again, if we can't answer it, we'll certainly get back to you soon with the answers. So let's see. The next question up. How long is the PD&E Section 7 consultation good for? Great question. And with that, we can go to probably John or Dave to talk about how long a Section 7 consultation is good for. And then Katasha, I want you to follow up with that as well if you have any additions.
As far as I know, it's good for forever, unless one of the reinitiation triggers is met. The consultation is good.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the situation doesn't change where our conclusions would change, there's not a set timeline.
Yeah, and so those 4 triggers for reinitiation, I think Dave covered the reinitiation clauses, but the 4 triggers for reinitiation include: number 1, if you change the project in a way that might change the potential for effects. So if the project changes, we need to come back and talk about it and see if it does change the potential effect. Number 2, and these aren't in any given order, but what if a new species is listed or a critical habitat is designated? So that could change how we consider the effects of a project. New species or critical habitat designated, or even if a species is removed from the endangered species list. Sometimes that happens on a regular basis, and want to make sure and know that you can reinitiate consultation there if we need to talk about that again. The third sort of clause there that I want to mention is that if there's a new way of looking at old information, we certainly want to go back because sometimes, well, technology is changing rapidly in very dynamic world that we live in, and so oftentimes we have new information that would help us look at a project differently and look at the potential for effects differently to endangered species, and we want to make sure that if there's new information that we consider that. We consider the new information, or we consider new ways of looking at old information. So in general, as John said, Section 7 consultation is good until something changes, and so stay in touch with us as you go through each stage of from permitting to construction and operation of whatever transportation facility you have in mind there, subject to consultation. Is there anything you'd like to add there, Katasha, or clarify?
I think you guys covered it perfectly well. I just think that from a DOT perspective, there's often, not always, but often a change in the design or the concept, I guess you could say, the PD&E concept from what the actual design looks like. So there's oftentimes we need to reinitiate, and it probably feels like it's a requirement, but like you and John pointed out, it's not so much unless there is that change or some of those other key points that you brought up require that reinitiation. So, thanks.
Right. So again, one of the things, overarching messages that we want to send to you is with endangered species compliance. We want to make sure that you know that the door is open. Give us a call. Folks here who have been presenting this information both last Tuesday and today, and then over the next couple of weeks are willing to make sure that you're comfortable and provide you with as much information to understand the process, something that we've gone through today and last week, and procedures, as well as the species, and make sure that you're aware of species ecology, life history, understand it enough to make good informed decisions, and as Adam did a little while ago, demonstrated that if you know something about a species and are more aware of it, it certainly gives you a deeper appreciation for the critters out there and the reasons that they're protected. So with that, let's see, Kendra, the next slide, I think, is one, as I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat box there. Remember to register for, if you haven't already, that webinar number 3 coming up next Tuesday. Same time, same channel, and register so we can be expecting you for that. Next week, we're going to continue with the consultation process. We're going to take a walk through the examples of from both of our agencies on some online resources, as well as how a project goes through the process. Once you send a project proposal over to the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service, what happens? And want to make sure you understand the steps that we go through, the things that we're considering, so that you know what information to provide. Then we'll do some additional species highlights, and hope that you're looking forward to that. So we'll learn more about sea turtles, snail kites, and manta ray, among other things. So I hope that you'll go ahead and, if you haven't already, sign up. Make sure to have plans to be here. Hope you're finding this to be informative and interesting, and worth spending some time with us here on Tuesday mornings. With that, I don't see any additional questions, but that's the teaser for next week. And again, we'll plan on seeing you then. So thank you for participating, and thank you on my behalf to the presenters today for doing such a wonderful job. John Rublick, David Rydeen, Adam Bream, and Katasha Cornwell. So thank you for the preparation that you put into the presentations, and look forward to seeing you all back here next week.